The night before Constantinople fell, Emperor Constantine the 11th did something that no history book quite prepares you for. He went around the room to every general, every soldier, every foreign ally who had stayed to die with him, and he asked each one for forgiveness. Then he walked to the Hagia Sophia, prayed in the greatest church on earth, and went to stand on the walls in the dark. He never came back.
Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull the blanket up a little. Maybe dim the screen just a touch. Because tonight we're going somewhere old. Somewhere very, very old. We're going to a city that sat at the edge of two worlds for over 1,000 years. A city of gold domes and crumbling walls, of emperors with names nobody can pronounce, of a civilization that refused to admit it was dying, even as the walls came down around it. We're going to Constantinople. And specifically, we're going to its last day, May 28th, 1453. The night before everything ended.
Now the Byzantine Empire had a remarkable talent for surviving things that should have killed it. It survived invasions by the Persians, the Arabs, the Bulgarians, the Rus, the Normans, various crusaders who were supposed to be on their way to the Holy Land, but somehow ended up sacking Constantinople instead. Looking at you, Fourth Crusade, 1204, that was a very bad look for everyone involved. It survived plagues and famines and a staggering number of emperors who were murdered by their own family members. Byzantine politics had a kind of creative violence to it. Blinding was considered a humane alternative to execution. If you blinded a rival, he couldn't be emperor, because emperors were supposed to be physically perfect. So you'd ruined his career without technically killing him. Very practical in a deeply unsettling way. But by 1453, the empire was not doing well. That's perhaps an understatement. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk to approximately the city of Constantinople itself, plus a few small territories in Greece that were trying their best. That's it. The 1,000-year empire had compressed down to one city and its suburbs. Everything else, the Anatolian heartland, the Balkans, the wealthy agricultural provinces that had funded the whole operation for centuries, all of it was gone, absorbed by the rising power of the Ottoman Turks. The Byzantines were surrounded. They had been surrounded for a long time. They were a small, exhausted, underfunded remnant of something that had once been enormous, and most of their neighbors were either indifferent to their survival or actively rooting for their collapse. The emperor, in the spring of 1453, was a man named Constantine the 11th, Constantine Palaiologos. And yes, it's somewhat poetic, maybe a little too poetic, that the last emperor of a city founded by Constantine I was also named Constantine. History does that sometimes, arranging things into a kind of neat, melancholy symmetry. Constantine XI was, by most accounts, a genuinely decent man, which in Byzantine emperor terms is practically a miracle. He was around 49 years old in 1453. He'd spent most of his adult life fighting, in the Peloponnese, in various skirmishes, in the kind of grinding, unglamorous defensive warfare that defines the last years of a shrinking empire. He was not a man of lavish court ceremony or elaborate theological disputes, which had occupied so many of his predecessors. He was practical, he was brave, he was tired, in the way that only someone carrying an impossible burden can be tired. And he knew with a fairly clear-eyed realism that his situation was very, very bad. Because outside the walls, an Ottoman army had arrived, a very large Ottoman army, and it had brought, among other things, some extremely large cannons. Part 2. The young Sultan and his very large cannons.
The man commanding that Ottoman army was Sultan Mehmed II. And if you want to understand why Constantinople fell when it did, you need to understand Mehmed. Because he was 21 years old in 1453. 21. And he had been planning the conquest of Constantinople essentially since he was old enough to have plans about anything.
Mehmed had become Sultan for the second time. It's a long story, we'll get there. In 1451, at the age of 19. And one of the first things he did after consolidating his position was to start preparing for the siege of Constantinople. Not because the city posed an immediate military threat to the Ottomans. By 1453, it really didn't. It was too small, too weak, too broke. But it posed a symbolic threat. Constantinople was the seat of the Roman Empire. Whatever the reality on the ground, the Byzantine emperors still held that title, that legacy, that ancient prestige. And Mehmed wanted it. He wanted to be the man who finished the job, the man who finally, definitively, brought down the city that had been resisting conquest for over 1,000 years. Mehmed was an interesting person. He spoke multiple languages: Greek, Latin, Arabic, Persian, Turkish. He was genuinely interested in history and philosophy. He apparently liked to have the ancient historians read to him while he ate, which is either very cultured or slightly unnerving, depending on your perspective. He was also ruthless in the specific, controlled way that effective rulers tend to be, not randomly violent, not given to rages, but entirely willing to do whatever was strategically necessary and not particularly troubled by it afterward. He'd had a somewhat turbulent entry into adulthood. His father, Murad II, had actually abdicated in 1444, handing power to Mehmed when he was only 12. The idea was that Murad wanted a rest, which is understandable, but 12 is perhaps a little young to run an empire. The Janissaries, the elite Ottoman infantry corps, were not thrilled with a 12-year-old sultan, and various crises unfolded fairly quickly, and Murad had to come back out of retirement to deal with them. So Mehmed had a brief, uncomfortable first stint as sultan, watched his father retake power, and then inherited properly when Murad died in 1451. It had, one imagines, given him certain opinions about the importance of being thoroughly in control. One of the things Mehmed did to prepare for the siege was commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban to build him some very large cannons. Urban had apparently first offered his services to the Byzantines, who couldn't afford him, so he went to the Ottomans, who very much could. The largest cannon Urban built for Mehmed was a genuinely extraordinary piece of engineering for the time. It was about 8 meters long. It fired stone balls roughly the size of a small child. It took several hours to reload after each shot. Moving it required dozens of oxen and hundreds of men. It was, in practical terms, not an especially efficient weapon. But it didn't need to be efficient. It just needed to be able to knock holes in walls that had been standing for 1,000 years. And it could do that. The walls of Constantinople were not ordinary walls. They were the Theodosian walls built in the early 400s, and they were an extraordinary feat of military engineering. They ran for miles across the landward side of the city, the only side not protected by water, in a triple line of moat, outer wall, and inner wall. The inner wall was about 12 meters high and nearly 5 meters thick, reinforced with towers every 15 years or so. These walls had stopped every army that had come against them for 1,000 years. Attila the Hun looked at them and decided to go conquer somewhere else instead. Various Arab caliphates had besieged the city and given up. The walls just held. They held because of their design and because of a weapon the Byzantines called Greek fire, and because of the seawalls protecting the harbor.
Because, for most of their history, the Byzantines had enough soldiers and enough money to defend them properly. In 1453, they had none of those things. Well, they still had the walls, but they didn't have the soldiers. The city's entire defensive force numbered somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 men. Mehmed's army outside the walls was somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000. The exact numbers are disputed by historians in the careful, precise way historians dispute things, but the general picture is not in dispute. It was a lot versus not very many. Constantine had sent desperate appeals for help to the West, to the Pope, to Venice, to Genoa, to anyone who might send ships and soldiers. Some help had trickled in. A Genoese military commander named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo arrived with about 700 men, which was genuinely useful. Giustiniani was a skilled soldier, and he took charge of the wall defenses. A few Venetian ships stayed in the harbor rather than leaving. Various individual knights and soldiers from across Europe chose to stay and fight. But the large-scale crusading force that Constantine hoped for never came. The Western powers were busy with their own affairs, their own wars, their own complicated politics. They sent sympathetic letters. They did not send armies. So by the time Mehmed set up his siege lines in early April 1453, Constantine had around 7,000 defenders to hold miles of walls against an overwhelming force. He distributed them as best he could, placing Giustiniani and his men at the most vulnerable section, the Mesoteichion, the middle wall, where the terrain dipped slightly and the fortifications were somewhat weaker. The harbor was protected by a great chain stretched across its mouth, preventing Ottoman ships from entering. The seawalls were defended by smaller detachments, and the cannons began to fire. Part 3. 53 days. The siege lasted 53 days, and most of those days had a kind of grim, grinding routine to them that doesn't make for very dramatic storytelling, but does make for rather good sleep content, which suits us perfectly. Each day, Mehmed's cannons fired at the walls. The great cannon, Urban's masterpiece, could only manage about 7 shots a day before it needed to cool down and be reloaded. But there were other cannons too, smaller ones, and they kept up a more consistent bombardment. The walls, which had stood for 1,000 years against battering rams and siege towers and armies of various sizes, were not designed to withstand gunpowder artillery. Stone balls weighing hundreds of kilograms hit the same sections of wall repeatedly. Sections crumbled, towers fell. Stretches of the great Theodosian wall, which had seemed eternal, developed gaps. And every night, Constantine's defenders went out with rubble and timber and whatever materials they could find, and they filled the gaps back in. A wall of earth and wood and broken
Stone, roughly piled, not particularly solid, but enough, maybe enough, to hold against the next assault. It was exhausting, unglamorous, necessary work, night after night, filling gaps, shoring up sections, moving rocks in the dark, while the Ottoman campfires burned on the other side. Inside the city, life had contracted into something small and anxious. Constantinople had once been a city of perhaps 500,000 people. By 1453, the population had declined dramatically. Perhaps 40 or 50,000 remained, maybe fewer. Many neighborhoods were largely empty. Gardens had grown up inside the city walls. Sheep grazed in areas that had once been dense urban streets. There was a slightly melancholy post-peak quality to the place even before the siege began. Beautiful churches still stood. The great Hagia Sophia still dominated the skyline, its dome a piece of engineering so remarkable that when it was built in the 500s, the people who built it weren't entirely sure it wouldn't collapse. It didn't collapse. It was still there in 1453, still extraordinary, still the largest church in the Christian world. Constantine spent those 53 days doing what emperors do in sieges. He moved along the walls, checking defenses, encouraging soldiers, making decisions about where to place the limited men he had. He attended church services. The Byzantines were deeply religious, and the clergy played an important role in keeping spirits up during the siege, processing through the streets with icons, leading prayers, maintaining the sense that God was watching and perhaps had not entirely abandoned them yet. Whether Constantine personally believed this or had simply learned that an emperor needs to perform belief even when he doesn't feel it, we can't really know. He left no diary. He wrote formal dispatches. He was not a man who recorded his inner life. There was one interesting moment in the middle of the siege, a small naval action that gave the defenders a brief, badly needed lift. 4 ships, 3 Genoese and 1 Byzantine, attempted to break through to the city carrying supplies from the island of Chios. The Ottoman fleet tried to stop them.
the Byzantine and Genoese sailors turned out to be considerably better at this particular kind of close-quarters naval fighting than the Ottomans, and after a long, confused engagement in the waters of the Bosphorus, all 4 supply ships made it through to the harbor. The city watched from the walls and cheered. Mehmed, watching from the shore on his horse, was apparently furious, to the point of riding his horse into the water in frustration, which seems like the kind of thing you do when you're 21 and accustomed to getting your way. But one successful supply run couldn't change the fundamental arithmetic. The walls were being slowly worn down, the defenders were exhausted and thinning, people were being wounded, dying, becoming too tired to fight effectively. No relief force was coming. The Venetian ships in the harbor talked among themselves about whether to stay or leave, and some of them left. The move inside the city shifted gradually from anxious hope to something quieter and heavier. Meanwhile, Mehmed solved the chain problem. The great chain across the harbor mount had prevented his fleet from entering the Golden Horn, the inlet on the city's northern side, and threatening the seawalls there, which were lighter and less heavily defended. So Mehmed had
his men build a road of greased logs over the hill north of the city and hauled his ships overland, out of the Bosphorus and into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain entirely. It took one night. In the morning, the people of Constantinople woke up to find Ottoman warships in the harbor they thought was safely closed. It was the kind of logistical improvisation that makes military historians use words like audacious. For the defenders, it meant they now had to worry about a second front. Constantinople redistributed his already thin forces again. Giustiniani and his Genoese soldiers stayed at the land walls. Other sections were covered by Venetians, Greeks, anyone who could hold a weapon. The chain of command was somewhat improvised and not entirely harmonious. The Venetians and Genoese didn't especially like each other, which was historically normal for the Venetians and Genoese, who managed to combine being trading rivals with being occasional military allies in a state of permanent mutual irritation. The cannons kept firing, the walls kept crumbling, the gaps kept being filled at night. The pattern repeated day after day, until the 53rd day arrived. Part 4. The Eve of the End. May the 28th, 1453. A Tuesday, which is, historians have noted, perhaps a little on the nose, given that Tuesday in Greek is treaty, derived from the word for third, but in the Byzantine world it had acquired a somewhat unlucky reputation. Constantinople had been sacked by the Fourth Crusade on a Tuesday in 1204. Various other bad things had happened on Tuesdays. The Greeks, to this day, consider Tuesday mildly inauspicious. This particular Tuesday was going to be extremely inauspicious. But we're getting slightly ahead of ourselves. On the evening of the 28th, nothing had happened yet. The guns had fallen quiet. Mehmed had ordered a day of rest and preparation for his troops. Tomorrow, May the 29th, would be the final assault. He had announced this to his commanders, and word had spread through the Ottoman camp. There was a quality of anticipation in the air, not frantic but purposeful, an army preparing itself for something it had been working toward for 7 weeks. Inside the city, Constantinople and his commanders knew what was coming. The unusual quiet after weeks of constant bombardment was not a relief. It was the kind of quiet that settles before a particular kind of storm. Constantinople spent the day in preparation, making his rounds of the walls one more time, speaking to the soldiers, making small adjustments to the dispositions of the defenders. And then, in the evening of May 28th, something happened that has been recorded by multiple witnesses, and has a quality that, regardless of what you believe about the divine, is worth describing. Constantinople organized a procession, the last great religious procession of the Byzantine Empire. Icons were taken from the churches, holy images that the Byzantines venerated with an intensity that often puzzled Western visitors who didn't quite understand the theology of it.
These icons were carried through the streets of the city. The clergy processed.
The soldiers who could be spared from the walls joined in. The remaining civilian population came out. And they walked through Constantinople. Through the neighborhoods that had been slowly emptying for generations. Past the great Forum of Constantine with his columns still standing. Past churches that had stood for centuries. Past streets that had been the center of the civilized world for 1,000 years.
Then Constantinople went back to his palace, briefly. And then, according to the sources, he went to the walls. He went to the section of the land walls near the Carycian Gate, close to where Giustiniani's men were positioned, and he waited. The night was not entirely quiet. There was movement in the Ottoman camp, the sound of an army preparing itself, drums perhaps at a distance, the flickering of countless campfires visible from the walls. Constantinian and his soldiers stood in the dark and watched and waited for the assault that they knew was coming, and that they knew, in all likelihood, they would not survive. It is, when you sit with it, a remarkably still image for the end of 1,000 years. An emperor in the dark, a few thousand tired men on old walls, the largest city in Christendom, empty and quiet behind them, its streets lit by nothing but the stars and the distant light of enemy fires. The Hagia Sophia's dome, a dark shape against the sky. And somewhere in the night, the last night, the slow, inevitable approach of morning. Part 5. The Last Hours. The assault began in the small hours of May 29th, roughly 1 or 2 in the morning by most estimates, though precise timekeeping in the 15th century had its limitations. Mehmed sent his forces in waves, a tactical choice that made considerable sense. The first wave, irregular troops called Bashi Bazouks, were sent in to wear down the defenders and exhaust the wall's defenders before the better trained forces were committed. It was not a sentimental approach, but it was effective. The Bashi Bazouks hit the walls in the darkness and were met by the defenders. Giustiniani's men on the land walls, Constantinian's Greek soldiers, the Phoenicians and scattered others. They held. The fighting was the kind of close, terrible work that happens when men try to climb walls and other men try to stop them. Ladders were pushed back. Men fell. The darkness made everything confused and loud and frightening. The Bashi Bazouks were not trained soldiers in any formal sense, and after a period of fighting that the sources suggest lasted an hour or 2, they pulled back. The walls held. The first wave was over. The second wave was better. Anatolian troops, more disciplined, better equipped. They hit the walls in the dark with more organization and more assistance. Again, the defenders held them. Again, there was fighting along the whole length of the land walls, attackers trying to force gaps, defenders scrambling to cover every weak point. Constantinian moved along the walls during this phase, appearing where the fighting was thickest, which was either inspiring leadership or a fairly direct way of getting killed, depending on your perspective. Probably both. This wave also eventually pulled back. The walls held. The defenders were exhausted. Some were wounded. Giustiniani was apparently wounded during this phase, a crossbow bolt, according to some sources, though others say it was a gunshot wound, and the exact nature of the injury has been discussed by historians in the careful way historians discuss things they can't quite verify. Whatever the wound, it was serious enough that Giustiniani decided he needed to leave the walls to have it treated. This was, as events would show, the critical moment. Giustiniani asked Constantine for the key to a small gate in the inner wall, a gate that allowed passage between the inner and outer wall, used for resupply and troop movement. Constantine, according to the sources, did not want to give it. He urged Giustiniani to stay, to hold his position, that the assault wasn't over, that his men needed to see him there. Giustiniani insisted. He was wounded. He needed medical attention. He would return once treated. Constantine gave him the key. Giustiniani left. His Genoese soldiers saw their commander being carried from the walls, and they broke. The Genoese had been the most professional and experienced soldiers defending the city, and when they saw Giustiniani's Eve, the unit cohesion, the thing that keeps soldiers in position when everything in them says to run, came apart. They followed him through the gate. They streamed back through into the inner wall and away from the fighting. The gap they left was real and immediate. The section of wall they'd been defending was now held by nobody, or not enough people. And the third Ottoman wave, the Janissaries, Mehmed's elite troops, the best trained, best equipped soldiers in the Ottoman army, arrived precisely at this moment. Whether by plan or by the brutal luck of timing, the Janissaries hit the walls just as the Genoese were leaving. A Janissary officer named Ulubatli Hasan, according to Turkish tradition, and this is one of those moments where the sources get a little hagiographic, as they tend to do around moments of great drama, planted an Ottoman flag on the outer wall. He may or may not have been killed immediately afterward, the sources differ, but the symbolism of it, whether it happened exactly as described or not, captures something real. The Ottomans were over the wall. From that moment, the defense unraveled. Word spread along the walls. The enemy is inside. The enemy is inside. Some defenders fought on. Many broke and ran. The gate that Giustiniani's men had fled through was open, and through it poured Ottoman soldiers who were now inside the landward defenses of Constantinople for the first time in the city's history. They spread out. They started moving through the streets. Constantine, when he understood what was happening, reportedly threw off his imperial regalia, the purple robes, the insignia of the emperor of the Romans. He took a sword and fought. He disappeared into the fighting at the walls. What happened to him in the next few minutes is genuinely not known. No one surviving the battle claimed to see him die. No body was definitively identified as his. The Ottomans found bodies at the walls afterward, and identified one as Constantine's by the purple boots. Emperors wore purple boots. It was one of the specific imperial markers, and someone was wearing them. But this identification was uncertain at the time, and remained so. He simply vanished into the last battle for his city, which is, in its way, the appropriate ending for an emperor named Constantine, who ruled a city named for a Constantine. In the last hours of an empire that had lasted 1,000 years, he went into the fighting, and he didn't come out.
And what exactly happened to him in those final minutes, in the dark, in the chaos, in the noise of a city falling? Nobody knows, and nobody will ever know. Part 6. The City in the Morning. By dawn on May 29, 1453, it was over. The Ottoman soldiers moved through the streets of Constantinople. The city, under the laws of siege warfare as they were understood in the 15th century, was subject to 3 days of sacking. This was considered a standard provision when a city refused to surrender and was taken by force. Mehmed had offered terms. Constantine had not surrendered, so the city was given to the troops. What followed was not pleasant, and we will not dwell on it extensively, because dwelling on it at length is not really what this video is for, and also because the full account of a city being sacked tends to be harrowing in ways that don't sit well at 2 in the morning. People were enslaved. Property was taken. Churches were entered and their contents stripped. The Hagia Sophia, the great church where Constantine had prayed just hours before, was entered. The people who had sheltered there, civilians who had hoped the church might protect them, which it didn't, were taken captive. The icons and sacred objects were carried out. Mehmed entered the city later that morning. He rode through the streets, which were quieter now, the immediate chaos of the sack settling into something more orderly as his officers imposed discipline. He went to the Hagia Sophia. According to the sources, he dismounted at the door, and he picked up a handful of earth.
and he poured it over his head, a gesture of humility before God, a recognition that all glory is temporary, that even the greatest conquest is dust. Then he went inside. He prayed in the Hagia Sophia, the first Muslim prayer in that building. He ordered that the church not be further damaged. He walked through it, looking up at the mosaics, the golden Christ figures still gleaming from the walls, and reportedly said, to whoever was with him, in whatever language he was speaking at that moment, something that has been translated various ways, but essentially expressed that the building was extraordinary and should be preserved. He was 21 years old, and he had just conquered Constantinople. He had achieved the thing he had been working towards since childhood. He would later call himself Kaiser-e-Rome, Caesar of Rome, the heir to the Roman Empire, the man who had finished it off and claimed its legacy. History has a way of staging its transitions dramatically, and this one had a kind of clean, final quality that most historical transitions don't manage. The Byzantine Empire had been dying for decades, perhaps centuries. Its end had been visible from a long way off, but it ended on this specific morning, with this specific battle, and with a 21-year-old sultan standing inside the greatest church in Christendom, pouring earth on his own head in a gesture of humility, which is either very moving or very complicated, or both, and doesn't really have a simple interpretation, which is perhaps appropriate.
Constantine Palaeologus, the last emperor of Rome, because that is what the Byzantines were, technically, the continuation of the Roman Empire, and he was its last emperor, was never found. His body was never definitively identified. He was never given a burial. He became, in the years after the fall, something of a legend in Greek tradition. There are stories, folk stories, the kind that attach themselves to leaders whose endings are uncertain, that he didn't die, that he was turned to marble by an angel, that he sleeps in a cave somewhere beneath Constantinople, waiting to return when the city needs him again. The Marble Emperor. It's a very human kind of story, the story of a good king who didn't really die, who was merely waiting. History produces these stories around people who die without a clear ending, without a body, without a grave. It's a way of not saying goodbye. The city was not destroyed. Mehmed had no interest in destroying it. He wanted a capital, not a ruin, and Constantinople was the greatest city in the region, and he intended to use it as such. He repopulated it over the following years, bringing in Greeks and Armenians and Jews and others, creating a cosmopolitan capital for his empire. He built mosques and markets. He restored infrastructure. The city that had been slowly emptying for decades gradually began to refill. Under the Ottomans, it became again one of the great cities of the world. It remained so for centuries. It is Istanbul now, as it has been officially called since 1930, and it is still there, still on that same triangle of land between the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, still with the Hagia Sophia standing, still with sections of the old Theodosian walls visible if you know where to look. The walls that held for 1,000 years, and then didn't. Part 7. What it meant, and why it still echoes. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 tends to show up in history textbooks as a major turning point, and for once, the textbooks are not exaggerating. It mattered in a lot of ways, some practical and some symbolic, and it's worth sitting with each of them for a moment. The practical effects were real and fairly immediate. The fall closed off a significant overland trade route between Europe and Asia. The Silk Road's western terminus had effectively been controlled by or routed through Byzantine territories for centuries. With an Ottoman Empire now firmly in control of the Bosphorus and the surrounding regions, European traders needed to find alternative routes. The search for those routes, going around Africa, going west across the Atlantic,
is one of the things that drove the European age of exploration in the later 1400s and 1500s. Columbus sailed in 1492. Vasco da Gama reached India by sea in 1498. Whether the fall of Constantinople was the primary cause of these voyages is something historians debate, but it was certainly part of the context. Greek scholars left the dying city before and after the fall, taking with them manuscripts, ancient Greek texts that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries for centuries, translations and copies and originals of works by Aristotle and Plato and Homer and dozens of others that had not been widely circulating in Western Europe. These scholars and their manuscripts fed into the Renaissance, the great cultural and intellectual revival that was already underway.
Italy, and would transform European art and thought over the next century. The Byzantine diaspora contributed, in a diffuse and hard-to-quantify way, to the intellectual flowering of the West. The symbolic effects were, if anything, larger. Constantinople had been the seat of Christian civilization in the East for over 1,000 years. Its fall to a Muslim power was a shock to the European Christian imagination, even for people who had not done very much to prevent it. The Pope called for a crusade. Various rulers expressed horror. Nothing much came of it in immediate military terms, but the event lodged itself deeply in Western and Eastern Christian consciousness. It was the end of something old and enormous, and it felt that way to people at the time. For the Greek world specifically, the fall became the central trauma of national consciousness, the wound that everything else was measured against, the thing that the marble emperor legend was trying to process and refuse to accept. For Greek Orthodox Christians, the Hagia Sophia's conversion to a mosque, and its later conversion to a museum in the 1930s, and its conversion back to a functioning mosque in 2020, remains charged with meaning in a way that outsiders often find puzzling, but that makes complete sense if you understand what that building represented and represents. It is not just a building, it is the building. It is where the last service was held, and where Constantine prayed before he went to the walls, and where 1,000 years of civilizational identity was concentrated. History doesn't have many moments with that quality of finality. Usually, things end gradually and messily, and the people living through it don't quite know when the end was. The fall of Constantinople was not like that. It had a date. It had a morning. It had a specific man walking into a specific building and praying, and it was done. The 1,000-year empire that started when Constantine I looked at a small Greek town on a peninsula between two seas and decided it was the right place for a new Rome. It ended when another Constantine, the 11th one, put on his sword in the dark and walked into the fighting, and didn't walk back out. Between those two moments, the Byzantine Empire survived Huns and Arabs and Persians and Crusaders and plagues and internal coups and theological controversies and economic collapses and the loss of province after province after province. It survived all of it until it didn't survive the last thing, which is the nature of all survivals. And the city is still there, on its peninsula, between the waters. The walls are still partly standing. The dome of the Hagia Sophia is still floating above the skyline, the one that wasn't supposed to stay up, but did, for 1,500 years so far. The dust is still there. The glory is complicated and contested, and layered with centuries of meaning and counter-meaning. But the city is still there. Part 8. The long, slow dying. Let's go back a little, before the walls, before the cannons, before Mehmed was even born. Because to really understand what was happening in May of 1453, you need to understand how the Byzantine Empire got itself into this particular predicament. And that story is long and winding, and full of the kind of slow-motion misfortune that is genuinely very relaxing to listen to at this hour of the night. The Byzantine Empire, as we mentioned, had a remarkable talent for survival, but it also had a talent, arguably an equal talent, for self-inflicted wounds. Byzantine court politics were extraordinarily complicated, and the word complicated here is doing a lot of work. The empire had no fixed rule of succession. An emperor's son did not automatically become emperor. What actually happened was that the reigning emperor would typically try to crown his son co-emperor during his own lifetime, making the succession clear. Sometimes this worked. Often it didn't. Rivals would appear. Generals would rebel. Court factions would shift. Emperors were blinded, strangled, thrown into monasteries, deposed, occasionally murdered, and on several notable occasions simply abandoned by everyone around them and left to figure out their own exile. The 9th and 10th centuries were actually a high point for Byzantine power, a period of capable emperors and successful military campaigns. The empire expanded, the Bulgarians were defeated, the Arabs were pushed back in Syria. The city of Antioch, which had been under Arab rule for centuries, was retaken. There was a moment in the mid-10th century when Byzantium was arguably the most powerful state in the Christian world, and possibly in the world generally, competing only with the great Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and the Song dynasty in China for that particular title. The Emperor Basil II, Basil Bulgar-Octanos, the Bulgar Slayer, the man who blinded 15,000 Bulgarians and sent them home, was the apex of this period. He was a competent, cold, relentless military commander who spent most of his long reign either on campaign or preparing for one. He never married, he had no children. He died in 1025 at around 70 years old, having spent the last few decades consolidating an empire larger than it had been in centuries. And then things got complicated again, because Basil died without an heir, and what followed was a period of about 50 years in which the throne changed hands with some frequency. Various military families competed with the civilian aristocracy for control, and the efficient administrative system Basil had built began to loosen. The army was neglected, taxes were rerouted, provincial defenses were allowed to decay. The empire was still wealthy and still impressive, but it was beginning to develop structural problems in the way that large, complex organizations develop structural problems, not dramatically, not visibly from day to day, but steadily, underneath, in ways that would become apparent when something tested the structure. The something that tested it arrived in 1071 in the form of the Seljuk Turks, the Battle of Manzikert, which is one of those battles that doesn't get as much attention in Western history as it deserves, possibly because it wasn't a Western battle, but which was genuinely transformative for the subsequent shape of the world. The Byzantine Emperor Romanus IV led an army into eastern Anatolia to deal with Seljuk raiding, and through a combination of bad luck, poor command decisions, and spectacular betrayal by one of his own generals, he was
defeated and captured. The Emperor of Byzantium was taken prisoner on the battlefield by the Seljuk Sultan, Alp Arslan, which was not a thing that was supposed to happen. The military defeat at Manzikert was not in itself necessarily fatal. Battles are lost. Armies can be rebuilt. What was fatal was what happened afterward. The capture of the emperor triggered a succession crisis back in Constantinople, because of course it did. A rival emperor was proclaimed. Romanos was eventually released by the Seljuks. Alp Arslan was actually fairly gracious about the whole thing. He respected Romanos as a fellow soldier and let him go in exchange for a ransom. But by the time Romanos got back, his throne had been taken, and he was blinded and sent to a monastery where he died of his wounds shortly afterward. And in the chaos of the succession crisis, nobody was paying attention to Anatolia, where the Seljuk Turks were moving in and settling down and making themselves at home. Anatolia was the heartland of the Byzantium Empire. It was where the best agricultural land was. It was where the best military recruiting grounds were. It was the bulk of the empire's territory and a huge portion of its tax base. Losing it, not in one dramatic defeat, but in the slow, chaotic process of political collapse and neglected defense that followed Manzikert, was the wound from which Byzantium never fully recovered. Everything that followed, the Crusades, the Latin occupation, the partial recovery, the final Ottoman pressure, all of it happened in the long shadow of Manzikert and the Anatolian heartland that slipped away in the decade after it. Part 9. The Crusaders who were supposed to help. Now here is where it gets slightly complicated. or more complicated. The Byzantium Empire, finding itself under pressure from the Seljuk Turks in the late 11th century, sent an appeal to the Pope in Rome asking for military assistance. They wanted mercenaries, essentially, soldiers from the West who could help fill the gaps in Byzantium defenses. What they got instead was the First Crusade, which was a somewhat larger operation than they had requested, and which came with its own agenda. The Crusades are a large topic that deserves more time than we can give them here. But for Byzantium purposes, the key thing to understand is that the relationship between the Byzantium Empire and the crusading armies that passed through Constantinople was from the very beginning one of profound mutual suspicion, barely held in check by mutual necessity. The Byzantiums thought the Crusaders were undisciplined barbarians who would cause trouble and probably steal things. The Crusaders thought the Byzantiums were treacherous, over-sophisticated, untrustworthy, and insufficiently enthusiastic about holy war. Both sides were not entirely wrong about the other. The First Crusade actually worked out tolerably well for Byzantium, all things considered. The Crusaders captured Antioch and Jerusalem, and some of the Anatolian territory that had been
lost to the Seljuks was at least temporarily recovered. There was friction, there were disputes about who owned what, but the damage was manageable. The Fourth Crusade was not manageable. The Fourth Crusade, which set out in 1202 ostensibly to fight in the Holy Land, and which ended up sacking Constantinople in 1204, was one of the more extraordinary diversions in the history of organized military expeditions. The short version is that the Crusaders ended up in debt to Venice for the transport fleet they'd hired, couldn't pay, and got redirected by the Venetians, who had commercial reasons to want Constantinople weakened, into attacking the Byzantine capital instead. There were also some Byzantine dynastic politics involved, a disputed emperor, promises made and broken, the usual. But the outcome was straightforward. In April of 1204, Crusaders who were supposed to be fighting Muslims in the Holy Land instead broke through the sea walls of Constantinople and sacked the city. For 3 days.
He was a pacifist operator, which in the context of Byzantine politics meant he fitted in reasonably well. He spent most of his reign trying to hold off the various Western powers who wanted to retake Constantinople, doing so largely through diplomacy, marriage alliances, and the willingness to make promises about church union, reuniting the Orthodox and Catholic churches that he had no real intention of keeping, but which bought time. Church union was a card that Byzantine emperors played and then put back in the deck and played again repeatedly for the next 2 centuries, each time infuriating the Orthodox clergy and populace who did not want to submit to Rome, and each time failing to produce the Western military support that was the whole point of the exercise. Michael VIII died in 1282 and was refused a Christian burial by the Orthodox Church, which had not forgiven him for his union policies. His successors continued in various directions of dysfunction. The 14th century was particularly eventful. There were civil wars, not one but several, the Palaiologos family being disinclined to settle succession questions peacefully when they could settle them expensively and violently. There was a theological controversy called the Hesychast controversy, which concerned a form of mystical prayer practiced by monks on Mount Athos, and which somehow became a major political issue involving court factions and military conflicts. There was the Black Death, which arrived in Constantinople in 1347 and killed a significant portion of the already declining population. There were the Ottomans, pressing from the east, taking territory, occasionally allied with one Byzantine faction against another in the civil wars, which is not a situation that ends well for the side inviting the outside power in. By the early 15th century, the empire consisted essentially of Constantinople, a few Aegean islands, and the despotate of the Morea in the Peloponnese, where Constantine Palaiologos had been governing before he became emperor. The last emperors of the Palaiologos line spent their reigns making pilgrimages to Western capitals, literally traveling to Venice and Rome and various royal courts, hat in hand, asking for money and soldiers. Manuel II, Constantine's father, made a 2-year tour of Western Europe between 1399 and 1403, visiting France and England, being received with honor and sympathy, and coming home with very little in the way of actual military assistance. The Western rulers liked Manuel. They admired him. They wrote kind things about how cultured and impressive he was. They did not send armies. Manuel lived to be 77, which for a Byzantine emperor was an achievement in itself. He died in 1425, having watched his empire contract further and further, and having probably understood that what he was handing to his successors was not so much an empire as the idea of an empire, a name, a claim, a few thousand tired people in a city that was too big for them, and walls that were very old, but still, for the moment, standing. His son John VIII spent his reign doing more or less the same thing Manuel had done, traveling west, negotiating church union, attending the Council of Florence in 1439, where he formally agreed to unite the Orthodox and Catholic churches in exchange for promised military assistance, came home, was met with fury by the Orthodox clergy and populace, who considered this a betrayal, and watched the promised Western Crusade materialize briefly, march into the Balkans, and get destroyed by the Ottomans at the Battle of Varna in 1444.
Which the Western appetite for crusading against the Ottomans was somewhat reduced, and John came home to die in 1448, childless, and to be succeeded by his brother Constantine, the 11th and last. Constantine inherited a position that was, in the most literal sense, impossible. There was nothing he could do that would save the empire. The resources were gone. The territory was gone. The allies were ambivalent at best. The Ottoman Empire surrounding him was young and confident, and commanded by a sultan who had been thinking about Constantinople since childhood. Constantine knew this. His decisions in the years and months, and finally hours before the end, were made by someone who understood clearly what was happening and chose to face it with as much dignity as he could manage, which was, in the circumstances, considerable. Part 11. Small details of a large ending. There are small details about the fall of Constantinople that don't make it into the big historical summaries, but that seem worth mentioning here, in the quiet of whatever hour this is. One of them is the last ship. A Venetian merchant vessel that had been in the harbor during the siege managed to escape in the chaos of the final assault, slipping out through the sea walls while the city was falling. It reached Venice some weeks later with survivors and news of the fall. The captain of this ship, Niccolo Barbaro, had kept a diary during the siege, a day-by-day account in the straightforward, practical language of a merchant seaman, noting the sounds of the cannons and the number of attacks and the state of the walls. It's one of the primary sources for what we know about the siege. The diary of a merchant who was there because he was doing business and stayed because leaving felt wrong, and eventually sailed away because staying had become impossible. History is often best preserved by people who were just going about their lives. Another detail. Giustiniani, the Genoese commander who left the walls wounded. He made it to a Genoese ship in the harbor. The ship sailed. He died on the island of Chios a few days later from his wounds. He never knew, in his final days on that island, the full extent of what his departure from the walls had set in motion, or perhaps he did know, and carried it with him in those last days. We don't have his side of it. The gate. The small gate in the inner wall through which Giustiniani's men fled. It was called the Cercoporta. And it turns out that in the chaos of the Genoese retreat, the gate was not properly secured behind them. It was left open or unlocked, and Ottoman soldiers found it and came through. This is the kind of detail that lodges in the mind. The small procedural failure, the gate that should have been locked and wasn't, that let the soldiers through while the main battle was still going on at the top of the walls. History pivoting on a door somebody forgot to close.
The candles in the Hagia Sophia on the last night. Multiple sources mention the candles, the church fully lit, the gold mosaics catching the light, the gathering of Orthodox and Catholic Christians who had spent centuries arguing about theology and were praying together in the last hours because the argument had become irrelevant. The image of those candles lit in the enormous space of that dome seems important somehow, worth holding on to. The light in the old church on the last night, while outside the Ottoman army was making its final preparations. The bells. Byzantine churches had bells, and during the siege, the bells were rung to signal alarms and to call people to prayer and to communicate information along the walls. In the final assault, the bells of Constantinople rang through the night. Signal bells, alarm bells, the bells of the Hagia Sophia and the smaller churches, all ringing in the dark while the battle moved along the walls. People in the city who were not at the walls would have heard the bells and known from their pattern, from their urgency, from their persistence, that something final was happening. The bells rang as the walls fell. Then, eventually, they stopped. The Hagia Sophia has a bell tower now, added much later, under the Ottomans, for the call to prayer. The original Byzantine bells are gone, melted down or taken centuries ago. But the building is still there. The dome is still there. The acoustic space inside it, the way sound moves in that particular volume of air under that particular dome, is the same acoustic space where the last service was held. If you go there and stand under the dome and listen, you are standing in the same air that held those last prayers and those last candles and that last gathering of people who knew on some level that they were at the end of something enormous. Part 12. After. The fall of Constantinople sent ripples outward through the world in ways that took years and decades to fully appear. We mentioned the trade routes and the scholars and the Renaissance. But there were other ripples too, smaller ones, more personal. The Greek diaspora that followed the fall scattered Byzantine scholars, artists, clergy, and nobility across the Mediterranean world. Some went to Venice, which had long ties with Constantinople and which absorbed a significant Greek community. Some went to Rome, where the Greek community around the Vatican grew considerably. Some went to Crete, which was Venetian territory, and which became, for the next century or so, one of the most interesting places in the Mediterranean. A place where Byzantine artistic traditions mixed with Italian Renaissance influences and produced a remarkable flowering of painting, icon making, and literature. The painter El Greco, born in Crete in 1541, is one of the distant downstream products of this mixing. His real name was Domenikos Theotokopoulos. He trained in the Byzantine icon tradition in Crete, moved to Venice and then Spain, and made paintings that are recognizably both things: Byzantine in their elongated figures and spiritual intensity, Renaissance in their technique and composition. The fall of a city, 80 years before he was.
History shaped the world he was born into and the art he made. History works like that, in long, slow, unexpected chains of consequence. The Ottoman Empire that took Constantinople did not, as some feared, immediately overrun the rest of Europe. It expanded, certainly, into the Balkans, threatening Vienna, taking Serbia and Bosnia and most of Hungary over the following decades. But it was also an empire that, like all empires, had its own internal complications, its own succession crises, its own periods of strength and weakness. Mehmed II continued to be Mehmed II, capable, ambitious, interested in classical history, occasionally terrifying, until his death in 1481 at the age of 49. He spent those 28 years after Constantinople campaigning almost continuously, which was apparently what he wanted from life. He conquered more territory in Anatolia and the Balkans. He invaded Italy briefly. There was an Ottoman landing at Otranto in 1480, which caused considerable panic in Rome, but he died before he could follow up on it, and the Italian adventure came to nothing. He was buried in Istanbul, in a complex he had built for himself, and the city that he had made his capital grew and flourished around his tomb.
The Hagia Sophia was converted to a mosque. The mosaics were covered, not destroyed mostly, just plastered over, because the Islamic prohibition on representational imagery in places of worship meant the golden Christs and the Virgin Marys couldn't be left uncovered. This was, in the long run, partly protective. The plaster preserved the mosaics underneath, and when the building was converted to a museum in the 20th century and the plaster was removed, many of the mosaics was still there, still gleaming, having been hidden for 500 years. The golden face of Christ Pantocrator, Christ ruler of all, is back on display now. It spent 5 centuries in the dark and came back into the light, which is the kind of detail that can mean various things depending on what you're inclined to believe. The walls of Constantinople, the Theodosian walls, the walls that held for 1,000 years, are still partially standing today. Not complete, not all of them, but significant stretches of the inner wall are still there, running through the western part of modern Istanbul. You can walk along them. They are large and old and covered in weeds in places, with towers that are still recognizably towers even after 15 centuries of weather and neglect and the attentions of various conquerors. Some sections have been restored, somewhat controversially among historians and archaeologists who have opinions about how restoration should be done. But the bones of them are original, the same stones that Constantine's soldiers piled rubble against in the dark, filling the gaps left by Urban's cannon, the same stones that the Janissaries came over in the final assault. History leaves more physical traces than people tend to realize. You can stand on the walls of Constantinople. You can stand under the dome of the Hagia Sophia. You can stand in the Hippodrome, which is a public square now, and look at the Egyptian obelisk that has been standing there since the Emperor Theodosius had it shipped from Alexandria in 390 AD, standing in the same place on the same base through the fall of Rome and the rise of Byzantium and the Crusades and the Ottoman conquest and the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the founding of the Turkish Republic and everything else, just standing there in the square being
an obelisk, doing its job. There's something very settling about that at this hour of the night. Things endure. Stones endure. The dome endures. The obelisk endures. The city endures. We should go back to Constantine at the end, because he is the heart of it in some way. Not Mehmed, who is a more conventionally interesting historical figure, younger, more dramatic, better documented, more obviously the protagonist of his own story. Constantine is the other kind of figure, the one who holds something together that is falling apart for as long as he can, with what he has, because it's his, and he loves it, and then goes into the dark. The legend of the Marble Emperor, the king who didn't die, who sleeps underground and will return, is very old as a type of story. The same legend attaches to King Arthur in British tradition, to Frederick Barbarossa in German tradition, to various other leaders whose deaths were uncertain or whose endings felt incomplete. It is a story that a people tells itself when it loses something it cannot accept losing, when the ending is too final to simply acknowledge and move on. He isn't really gone. He's just waiting. He'll come back when we need him.
Lost to the Seljuks was at least temporarily recovered. There was friction, there were disputes about who owned what, but the damage was manageable. The Fourth Crusade was not manageable. The Fourth Crusade, which set out in 1202, ostensibly to fight in the Holy Land, and which ended up sacking Constantinople in 1204, was one of the more extraordinary diversions in the history of organized military expeditions. The short version is that the Crusaders ended up in debt to Venice for the transport fleet they'd hired, couldn't pay, and got redirected by the Venetians,
who had commercial reasons to want Constantinople weakened, into attacking the Byzantine capital instead. There were also some Byzantine dynastic politics involved, a disputed emperor, promises made and broken, the usual. But the outcome was straightforward. In April of 1204, Crusaders who were supposed to be fighting Muslims in the Holy Land instead broke through the sea walls of Constantinople and sacked the city for 3 days. What they did to Constantinople in those 3 days was, by any measure, catastrophic. The libraries, the artworks, the accumulated wealth of a civilization, things that had been preserved for 8 or 9 centuries, objects from the ancient Roman world, Greek manuscripts, relics, gold, were taken, destroyed, or scattered. The famous bronze horses that still sit atop the Basilica di San Marco in Venice today came from Constantinople's hippodrome, carried off as trophies. The city was not burned, mostly, but it was stripped. And then the Crusaders set up their own empire there, the Latin Empire of Constantinople, which lasted until 1261, when a Byzantine successor state called the Empire of Nicaea managed to retake the city. But the damage was done in ways that went beyond the physical. The Byzantines recaptured their capital, but they recaptured it weakened, poorer, stripped of much of its wealth, with their prestige seriously damaged and their relationship with the Western Christian world permanently complicated by the memory of what those Western Christians had done in 1204. It's difficult to enthusiastically cooperate with people who sacked your capital within living memory. It created a bitterness in Byzantine-Western relations that never fully healed, and which made the Western military assistance that might have saved Constantinople in 1453 extremely difficult to arrange and even more difficult to trust. Part 10. The Palaiologos family, or how to run a dynasty into the ground with great personal style. The dynasty that held the Byzantine throne from 1261 until 1453 was the Palaiologos family, and they were, in their way, remarkable. Not always effective, not always competent, frequently out of money, occasionally out of their minds, but never dull. They ruled a shrinking empire with a kind of stubborn grandeur that is either admirable or tragic, or most likely both. The founder of the dynasty, Michael VIII Palaiologos, retook Constantinople from the Latins in 1261. He was a capable emperor, a skilled diplomat, and a fairly ruthless political.
The Hippodrome sat next to the imperial palace complex, right at the eastern tip of the peninsula. It was enormous, 400 meters long, able to hold perhaps 100,000 spectators, which would have been a significant fraction of the entire city population. The central spine of the track, the spina, was decorated with ancient monuments brought from across the empire. The Egyptian obelisk from Luxor that Theodosius had installed in 390, still there today. The serpent column from Delphi, a bronze monument that had originally commemorated the Greek victory over the Persians at Plataea in 479 BC, brought to Constantinople by Constantine I. A bronze statue of the 4 horses that now sit above the entrance to San Marco in Venice, before the Fourth Crusade took them. The Hippodrome was a museum as much as a racing venue, a collection of trophies from the empire's long history, arranged around a track where men raced horses for the entertainment of crowds who took the whole thing extremely seriously. The churches. Constantinople was full of churches. The Byzantines built churches the way other civilizations built temples, with the same combination of religious devotion and civic pride, and the desire to leave something permanent behind. The small neighborhood churches, hundreds of them, most of them gone now. The larger churches associated with particular monasteries or imperial foundations, and above them all, the Hagia Sophia. We've mentioned the dome, but the full scale of the building is worth describing. It was built in 5 years, 532 to 537, by the Emperor Justinian I, who upon completing it reportedly said that he had surpassed Solomon. This was considered either extremely confident or extremely impious, depending on who you asked.
The building was designed by two men named Anthemius of Tralles and Asidoros of Miletus, who were mathematicians and engineers rather than architects in the conventional sense, and who created something that nobody had built before, and that nobody would quite manage to replicate for a very long time afterward. The central dome, about 31 meters in diameter, appears to float because of the ring of windows around its base. 40 windows, letting in light from all directions, so the dome seems to have no visible support, to hang in the air above the space. The interior was covered in marble and gold mosaic. The effect, by all accounts, was overwhelming. Foreign visitors described leaving services unable to say whether they had been on earth or in heaven, which was precisely the intended effect. The markets and the trade. Constantinople sat at the intersection of the main trade routes between Europe and Asia, between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Goods moved through it constantly, silk from China coming along the Central Asian routes, spices from the east, furs from Russia and the north, wine and grain from Anatolia and Egypt. The city had designated market areas for different goods: the silk market, the spice market, the book market, which is a detail worth pausing on. A city large enough and literate enough to have a dedicated book market. Manuscripts were produced in the city's scriptoria, copied by monks and professional scribes, bought and sold and collected by wealthy citizens who maintained private libraries alongside the great imperial and monastic collections.
The food. The Byzantines ate bread, fish, vegetables, legumes, olive oil, wine. The fish was important. Constantinople was surrounded by water, and the waters around it were extraordinarily productive. The Bosphorus, in particular, where the currents from the Black Sea brought nutrients and where fish schooled in enormous numbers during the migration seasons. Bluefish, mackerel, tuna, swordfish, sturgeon from the Black Sea. The markets along the harbor were full of fish at the right seasons. There were also the market gardens. Inside the city walls, the land that had emptied as the population declined had been turned to vegetable growing, so that by the 15th century the city was in the strange position of having farms inside its own walls, which was both practical and a visible reminder of how much the population had shrunk from the old high water mark. Food and water to the defenders. The monasteries organized their resources for distribution. The churches became centers of community life in the way they often do during crises, places to gather, to pray, to hear news, to find out who had been wounded or killed. The clergy processed through the streets with icons during particularly heavy bombardments, which served the double purpose of spiritual comfort and demonstrating publicly that the church was present and functioning and had not given up. There was a particular community of people in the city worth mentioning: the Venetians. Venice had a long, complicated history with Constantinople. They had participated in the Fourth Crusade sack in 1204, which the Byzantines had not forgotten. But they also had deep commercial ties to the city, a permanent community of Venetian merchants who lived in their own quarter near the harbor, the Venetian Baio, who served as something like an ambassador. In 1453, the Venetian community was caught in a genuine dilemma. Venice and the Ottoman Empire were at that moment technically at peace, and attacking the Ottomans could jeopardize Venetian trading rights throughout the eastern Mediterranean. On the other hand, Constantinople was full of Venetian citizens and Venetian property, and allowing it to fall without doing anything felt both dishonorable and practically dangerous. The Venetian ships in the harbor went through extended deliberations about whether to stay or sail. Some sailed. Others voted to stay and fight. The men who voted to stay, knowing what they were voting for, were making a...
Let's slow down for a moment and just walk through Constantinople. Not in 1453, in its reduced and anxious final state, but earlier, say the 10th century, the high point, when the empire was still large and the city was still full. Because it's worth understanding what this place actually was at its height before we watch it dwindle. Constantinople in the 10th century was, by the estimates of historians who study such things, probably the largest city in the Christian world, and possibly in the entire world west of China. A population somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people, depending on which decade you choose and which historian you trust. For context, London at the same period probably had around 15,000 people, Paris perhaps 20,000. These were towns. Constantinople was a city in the full ancient sense of the word, dense, layered, noisy, complicated, smelling of fish and spices and animals and the sea. The physical layout of the city followed the shape of the peninsula, the triangular spit of land jetting out between the Golden Horn to the north and the Sea of Marmara to the south, with the Bosphorus at its eastern tip where the two waters met. The land walls ran across the western base of the triangle. Inside those walls, the city was organized around a central spine, the Messe, the middle street, running from the Golden Gate in the west all the way to the Augustion, the great central square near the eastern tip. The Messe was colonnaded, lined with shops and monuments, paved, maintained. It was the main artery of the city's commercial and ceremonial life. Imperial processions moved along it, merchants traded along it, pilgrims walked along it on their way to the great churches. The forums punctuated the Messe at intervals. The Forum of Constantine, with its tall column topped by a statue of Constantine I, dressed as the sun god, which tells you something about the interesting mixture of Christianity and older Roman religious imagery that characterized the early Byzantine period. The Forum of Theodosius, larger, grander, decorated with columns whose bases were carved with relief triumphs and battles. The Forum of the Ox, which had an actual bronze ox at its center, and which was used for various civic purposes that we don't need to go into here, though historians have noted that some of them were not entirely pleasant. Forums in ancient cities were multi-purpose spaces, and not all the purposes were ceremonial. The Hippodrome sat next to the imperial palace complex, right at the eastern tip of the peninsula. It was enormous, 400 meters long, able to hold perhaps 100,000 spectators, which would have been a significant fraction of the entire city population. The central spine of the track, the spina, was decorated with ancient monuments brought from across the empire. The Egyptian obelisk from Luxor that Theodosius had installed in 390, still there today. The serpent column from Delphi, a bronze monument that had originally commemorated the Greek victory over the Persians at Plataea in 479 BC, brought to Constantinople by Constantine I. A bronze statue of the 4 horses that now sit above the entrance to San Marco in Venice before the Fourth Crusade took them. The Hippodrome was a museum as much as a racing venue, a collection of trophies from the empire's long.
People who had lived in Constantinople their whole lives were sold into slavery and dispersed across the Ottoman Empire, ending up in households in Anatolia or the Balkans or Egypt, carrying their language and their memories with them into conditions that were, by any measure, terrible. Some were ransomed by their families or by Venetian or Genoese merchants. Some found ways to escape or purchase their freedom over time. Many did not. The 40,000 who stayed became part of the human cost of the thing we are describing, the individual tragedies contained within the large historical event, and they deserve to be named, even if their names are not known. Part 16. The Ottoman Camp. On the other side of the walls, the world of the Ottoman army was its own distinct thing, worth spending a little time in. Because sieges are not just about the defenders, they are about the besiegers too, who also have to sit in one place for weeks and months and maintain discipline and morale and supply chains and all the other logistical complexities of keeping a large force in the field.
Mehmed's army was organized around several distinct components: the Janissaries, who were the elite infantry and the Sultan's personal household troops, disciplined, well-equipped, trained from childhood in some cases, the professional corps of the Ottoman military; the Anatolian and Rumelian Sipahis, the cavalry forces drawn from the empire's eastern and western provinces respectively; the Bashi Bazouks, the irregular infantry recruited from various sources, used as the expendable first wave of assaults; the artillery train, with Urban's great cannon and the smaller supporting pieces; the fleet, stationed in the Bosphorus and eventually, after the ships were hauled overland, in the Golden Horn as well; and the vast logistical tail that any large medieval army required: the supply wagons, the craftsmen, the medical staff, the religious figures who accompanied the army and offered prayers and legitimation for the enterprise. Mehmed himself was at the center of this. He was 21, and he was running a complex military operation with a competence that was, objectively, remarkable for his age. He had surrounded himself with experienced advisors, his viziers, his military commanders, but the decisions were his, and he was clearly in command in a real and not merely ceremonial sense. He moved through the camp, inspected the cannon emplacements, consulted with his engineers, made decisions about where to concentrate the bombardment, dealt with the problem of the Byzantine harbor chain. He was, by the accounts that survive, energetic and focused throughout the 7 weeks of the siege, which is harder than it sounds. Sieges are boring. Sieges are waiting. Maintaining the concentration and discipline required to see a siege through to its end, week after week while the walls slowly crumble, and the moments of actual
Action are separated by long stretches of nothing, requires a particular kind of temperament. Mehmed apparently had it. The religious dimension of the enterprise was important and present throughout. The Ottoman assault on Constantinople was framed in Islamic terms. The city had been a target of holy war for centuries. The Prophet had reportedly spoken of its eventual conquest, and taking it had the significance of fulfilling a long-held religious aspiration. Mehmed was not a particularly pious man in the personal devotional sense. He was interested in philosophy and classical history and the exercise of power in ways that went well beyond the strictly religious. But he understood the legitimizing power of religious framing and used it effectively. The imams in the camp offered prayers for the success of the enterprise. The night before the final assault, there were prayers throughout the Ottoman camp, and the army was prepared for the great effort of the following day in a way that combined military briefing with religious ceremony. There was also pragmatism. Mehmed issued specific orders about what was and what was not permissible during the taking of the city. The 3 days of sacking were standard military practice, but there were limits. No destroying buildings that could be useful, no burning down neighborhoods, specific protection for certain structures. He wanted a capital, not a ruin. The orders were not perfectly followed, of course. Armies in the immediate aftermath of a successful assault are not at their most orderly. But the intent was clear, and the city that emerged from the 3 days of sacking was damaged but intact, capable of being rebuilt, capable of functioning again. After the sacking was over and Mehmed's officers had restored order, the Sultan moved into the city and the process of transformation began. Constantinople became Istanbul. The name had been used informally for years in Turkish, derived from a Greek phrase meaning roughly to the city or in the city, and it gradually replaced the old name over the following centuries. New populations were brought in. The administration was reorganized. Mehmed appointed a new Greek Orthodox patriarch, Gennadius Scholarius, a scholar and theologian who had actually been one of the opponents of church union,
which tells you something about Mehmed's political instincts. He was not trying to destroy Greek Orthodox Christianity. He was trying to incorporate it into his empire as a functioning institution under his authority, which was a different and more sophisticated approach than simple suppression would have been. The city began to breathe again, slowly and differently, and as a different kind of place. But it began. Part 17. Greek fire and other things the Byzantines were good at.
We've spent a lot of time on the fall and the political history and the big dramatic moments. Let's drift a little, the way this kind of narrative is supposed to drift, into some of the more interesting specific things about Byzantine civilization that tend to get lost in the larger story. Greek fire. We mentioned it earlier, and it deserves more attention. Greek fire was an incendiary weapon used by the Byzantine navy from at least the 7th century onward. It burned on water. It could not be extinguished with water. Dousing it apparently made it worse. It was projected through tubes mounted on Byzantine warships, something like a flamethrower, spraying burning liquid at enemy ships. The exact composition of Greek fire is not known. The Byzantines guarded the secret carefully, and it was apparently lost at some point during the medieval period, because by the time historians started asking questions about it in detail, nobody could reproduce it. Various theories have been proposed over the centuries: petroleum derivatives, quicklime, various other chemicals. Modern chemists have made educated guesses, but the exact formula, if there was a single formula, is gone, which means that for several centuries, the Byzantine navy had a weapon that nobody else had, and that was apparently genuinely terrifying to encounter, and then the knowledge of how to make it was simply lost, which is the kind of thing that happens in civilizations in decline. Practical knowledge requires transmission. If the people who know a thing die or are scattered before they can pass it on, the thing is simply gone. The Byzantines were also good at diplomacy in ways that their neighbors sometimes found irritating. Byzantine foreign policy relied heavily on what modern scholars call soft power, the projection of the empire's wealth and prestige and cultural sophistication as instruments of influence. Foreign rulers were invited to Constantinople and overwhelmed by the grandeur of the imperial court. The throne room had mechanical golden birds that sang when guests entered, and a mechanical lion that roared. The floor was polished stone. The walls were covered in mosaics. The ceremony was elaborate and carefully choreographed to maximize the impression of Byzantine magnificence. Ambassadors went home and described all of this in terms that suggest it had the intended effect. The Rus ambassador, who visited in the 10th century and attended a service in the Hagia Sophia, famously reported back that his people could not tell whether they were in heaven or on earth, and this experience was one of the factors that influenced the Rus Prince Vladimir to adopt Orthodox Christianity for his people. Byzantine religious and cultural influence spreading outward through the deliberate cultivation of awe. The legal tradition. The Byzantines inherited Roman law and developed it extensively over 1,000 years. Justinian's great legal codification in the 6th century, the Corpus Juris
Civilis, collected and organized the accumulated Roman legal tradition into a systematic whole that became the foundation of legal systems across medieval Europe and remains influential in the legal codes of many countries today. This is not a minor inheritance. The concept of legal codification, the distinction between public and private law, the framework of civil law that most of Europe outside England uses, these have Byzantine roots. The empire that fell in 1453 is still present, in a real sense, in the legal structures of France and Germany and Italy and dozens of other countries in ways that most people who live under those laws never think about. The art. Byzantine art gets a somewhat unfair reputation in Western contexts, partly because it was seen through the lens of the Renaissance which succeeded it, and which defined itself partly in opposition to what it characterized as the stiff, formulaic quality of medieval art. But Byzantine art was doing something different, not failing to do what Renaissance art did. The elongated figures, the gold backgrounds, the frontal poses, the stylized drapery, These were not attempts at naturalism that fell short. They were a deliberate aesthetic theology. The icons were not meant to be windows onto the natural world. They were meant to be windows onto the spiritual world, images of holy persons as they existed in eternity rather than in time. The absence of perspective was not a technical failure. It was a refusal to locate the holy figures in a specific earthly moment. They existed outside space and outside time, and the art communicated this by refusing the conventions of spatial representation. This is actually quite sophisticated when you sit with it. And the technical quality of Byzantine mosaic work in particular, the way gold tesserae were angled so they caught light differently depending on where you stood, creating a kind of shimmering effect that made the figures seem to move slightly, was not naive. It was expert. The great mosaics of Ravenna in Italy, Byzantine work from the 6th century, are still astonishing in person in a way that photographs cannot fully capture. The Hagia Sophia mosaics, what remains of them, are still astonishing. The tradition that produced them was sophisticated and intentional and beautiful on its own terms. The Byzantines also maintained the Roman tradition of public baths, the thermae, the bath complexes where people went to bathe, socialize, conduct business, gossip. Constantinople had many of them, and they remained in use through much of the Byzantine period, declining as the city's population declined, and the infrastructure to maintain them became harder to sustain. The social life of the bath, the particular kind of easy, egalitarian mixing that happens when everyone is in the same room with no clothes on, was a feature of Byzantine urban life in its better centuries. Another small piece of what the city was, at its height, before the long, slow dwindling. We've been circling around the 6th century emperor Justinian I without properly stopping there. And we should stop there, because Justinian is one of the most remarkable figures in Byzantine history, and his story is one of the better examples of how the empire worked at its most ambitious. Justinian was emperor from 527 to 565. That's 38 years, which is a long reign by any standard, and a very long reign by Byzantine standards, where emperors had a tendency to be shortened. He came from the rural Balkans, the nephew of the previous emperor, Justin I, and he had the particular energy and ambition of someone who had arrived at power from outside the established aristocracy. He was not of the old families. He had gotten where he was through intelligence and the fortunate circumstance of his uncle's success, and he intended to do something with the opportunity. What he intended to do, it turned out, was reconquer the Western Roman Empire. The Western Empire had collapsed in the late 400s, replaced by various Germanic kingdoms, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Vandals in North Africa, the Visigoths in Spain. Justinian looked at this situation and decided it was temporary. Rome was Roman. The western provinces were Roman. The Germans were a phase. He was going to fix it. His generals, particularly Belisarius, one of the most capable military commanders in late Roman history, actually made significant progress on this project. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa was conquered in about a year, which genuinely surprised everyone, including Justinian. Italy took longer, much longer, nearly 20 years of grinding warfare that devastated the Italian peninsula and left it poorer and more depopulated than the Gothic rule it replaced. Spain was partially recovered. At the peak of Justinian's reconquest, the empire controlled much of the Mediterranean coastline for the first time since the Western collapse. But the reconquest was expensive, ruinously expensive. It stretched the empire's finances to their limit and beyond. It pulled military resources away from the eastern frontier, where the Persian Sassanid Empire was a constant and serious threat. And the recovered territories, particularly Italy, were never securely held. Within a few years of Justinian's death, the Lombards, another Germanic people, invaded Italy and took most of it back, leaving the Byzantines with only fragments. The Great Reconquest was largely undone within a generation.
This pattern, enormous effort, significant initial success, ultimately unsustainable, runs through Byzantine history like a thread. The empire repeatedly overextended, repeatedly recovered some of what it lost, repeatedly found that the recovery was harder to hold than it had been to achieve. Justinian's reconquest is perhaps the grandest example of this pattern, but it is not the only one. Now, Justinian's wife was Theodora, and Theodora is worth a great deal of your attention. She was, by the almost universal agreement of historians who have studied the period, one of the most capable and influential consorts in Roman or Byzantine history. She was also, by the almost universal agreement of the hostile sources, a woman of extremely low origins, the daughter of a bearkeeper at the Hippodrome, an actress before she became empress, and the sources written by people who disliked her are extremely detailed and specific about exactly what that meant in 6th century Constantinople. The historian Procopius, who wrote admiringly about Justinian's military campaigns in his official history, and then wrote a secret history that is essentially a prolonged expression of horror about Justinian and Theodora, describes Theodora's pre-imperial career in terms that are both lurid and almost certainly exaggerated, because Procopius had opinions and was not trying to be objective.
Byzantine manner, looking out at you from 15 centuries away, with an expression that is, if you spend time with it, quite something. Part 19. The long view from the peninsula. Let's come back to the peninsula, the triangle of land, the place, because Constantinople is, in the end, inseparable from its geography. The city existed where it existed for a reason. The Bosphorus, the Golden Horn, the Sea of Marmara, the extraordinary natural harbor that allowed it to control the movement of ships between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. This geography was not incidental. It was the foundation of the city's wealth and its strategic importance, and its ability to survive things that should have killed it. You could not easily take Constantinople by sea. The harbor chain, the sea walls, the Byzantine navy. You could not easily take it by land. The Theodosian walls, the triple defensive line, the narrow front that prevented a numerically superior army from bringing its full force to bear. The geography conspired with the engineering to make the place very difficult to take. It took gunpowder to change the calculation. The Theodosian walls were built against the weapons of the ancient and early medieval world. Battering rams, siege towers, scaling ladders, Greek fire in reverse. They were not built against heavy artillery. When Urban's cannon began firing in April 1453, it was deploying a technology that the walls had not been designed to resist. And the walls, for all their thickness, for all their towers, for all their 1,000 years of standing, could not adapt. Stone against stone balls of that weight, fired at that velocity, was always going to go one way. The city is still on the same peninsula. The geography has not changed. The Golden Horn is still there. The Bosphorus is still there. The Sea of Marmara stretches south and west. Still the same cold blue-green it has been for 10,000 years of human habitation on these shores. Istanbul is one of the largest cities in the world now, sprawling far beyond the boundaries of the old Byzantine city, crossing the water onto the Asian shore,
filling the hills behind the Golden Horn with neighborhoods that Byzantine emperors never imagined. The population that was 40,000 in the last years of the empire is now 15 million or more. But the old city, the city within the old walls, is still there inside this larger modern place. You can still trace it. The Messe is roughly where a modern street runs. The Hippodrome is a public park. The column of Constantine is still standing in what is now called Chamberlain Tash, slightly crooked.
Smoke darkened, stripped of the bronze sheathing that once covered it. The statue of Constantine long gone from its top, but the column itself still there. 23 meters of ancient stone, standing in the middle of a busy urban neighborhood, surrounded by traffic and pedestrians and tea houses, having stood in that spot for 1,700 years. 1,700 years. The city has been built and burned and rebuilt and conquered and lost and conquered again all around it, and the column is still there. The Hagia Sophia is still there. The dome is still floating. The windows around its base are still letting in the light from all directions in the way Anthemios and Isidoros designed them to 15 centuries ago. The gold mosaics that were covered by plaster for 500 years are being slowly restored, some of them in the parts of the building that are open to visitors. The face of Christ Pantocrator in the upper gallery, gold and solemn, looking down from a surface that has been there since the 9th century, is visible again. And the call to prayer sounds from the minarets that the Ottomans added, and the tourists move through the space in groups, and the acoustic dome holds all the sounds as it has held them since Justinian's builders raised it, and the light comes in through the windows, and the building simply continues to be what it is. There is a particular kind of peace in thinking about places that have been standing longer than any individual human life, longer than any individual historical moment, that have seen empires rise and fall and been there before and after. Not because the human cost of history doesn't matter. It does matter enormously. The 40,000 people in Constantinople in 1453 matter. The Theodora who died of cancer at 40-something matters. The Romanos IV who was blinded and sent to a monastery after being released from captivity matters. The individual people inside the history matter. But there is also something settling about the buildings that remain. The column, the dome, the walls. The obelisk from Luxor that Theodosius brought to Constantinople in 390 and that is still standing in what is now Sultan Ahmed Square, still on its original base, still the same stone that was cut in Egypt 3,500 years ago to commemorate a pharaoh whose name most people would have to look up. The stone is still there. The peninsula is still there. The water is still there. The city is still there. Part 20. Good night, Constantinople.
We've been here a while now. We've walked through the forums and the markets and the churches. We've stood on the walls in the dark and watched the Ottoman campfires. We've sat in the Hagia Sophia for the last service. We've watched Constantine go into the battle that he didn't come back from, and Mehmed pour earth on his own head in a gesture of humility before the God he had served by conquering the city. And the column still standing in the square, and the dome still floating above the space where the light comes in. History is very long. That's perhaps the main thing it teaches, if you spend enough time inside it. Very long, and full of people who were trying to do something, hold something together, build something, defend something, take something, understand something, and who sometimes succeeded and sometimes didn't, and who were gone now in any direct sense,
and yet not entirely gone, because the buildings are still there, and the laws are still there, and the paintings are still there, and the stories are still there. Constantinople is still there. Istanbul, the city, Ipoli, whatever you call it, the peninsula is still there between its waters, and the dome is still up, and the column is still standing in its square, and under the old Byzantine streets, if you believe in that kind of story, the marble man is still sleeping, and has been sleeping for 570 years, and shows no particular sign of waking up. And perhaps that's all right. Perhaps the city doesn't need him anymore. Perhaps the city has done what cities do, absorbed the grief and the memory and the long history, and kept going, kept accumulating, kept being the city, carrying all of it with it into whatever comes next. The lights are off now. The cannon has stopped firing. The bells have stopped ringing. The last service in the great church is over, and the candles are out. The empire is gone. The city remains. You can sleep now. Part 21. The emperors nobody talks about. Byzantine history has a habit of producing extraordinary emperors, and then burying them under the more famous names. Everyone has heard of Justinian. Fewer people have heard of Heraclius, who is arguably just as interesting, and who saved the empire at a moment when it genuinely looked finished.
Heraclius became emperor in 610 after a revolt against the previous emperor Phocas, who had been a particularly unpleasant ruler, even by the creative standards of Byzantine bad governance. Phocas had come to power through a military mutiny, had his predecessor Maurice executed, along with Maurice's sons, while Maurice watched, and spent his reign conducting purges and alienating basically everyone. When Heraclius sailed from Carthage with a fleet to overthrow him, the people of Constantinople opened the harbor chain to let him in. Phocas was captured, reportedly mutilated, and thrown into the sea. Nobody mourned him. Heraclius inherited an empire in serious trouble. The Sasanic Persian Empire under Khosrow II had used the chaos of Phocas's reign to launch a massive invasion. The Persians had taken Syria, they had taken Palestine, they had taken Jerusalem, and in doing so had captured the true cross, the relic believed to be the actual cross on which Christ was crucified, which was kept in Jerusalem, and which was the most sacred object in Christendom as far as most Byzantine Christians were concerned. They had taken Egypt. They were threatening Anatolia. The Avars and Slavs were pressing from the north into the Balkans. The empire had been cut nearly in half. What Heraclius did next took about 15 years and is one of the more remarkable military comebacks in ancient or medieval history. He reorganized the remaining finances, melted down church treasures to fund the army, negotiated carefully with the Avar threat to the north to buy time, and then launched a series of campaigns deep into Persian territory that reversed the entire strategic situation. He fought in Iran. He fought near the Caspian Sea. He recaptured Syria and Palestine and Egypt. He recovered the true cross and brought it back to Jerusalem in person, which was a moment of extraordinary symbolic power for the empire and for the Christian world generally. The Persian Empire, exhausted and destabilized by the long war, collapsed into internal crisis shortly afterward. Khosrow was overthrown and killed by his own son. The great Persian-Byzantine wars that had been running in various forms for centuries were simply over. And then, within 10 years, both empires were swept by the Arab conquests that emerged from the Arabian Peninsula following the death of the Prophet Muhammad. The Byzantine-Persian wars had exhausted both sides at precisely the moment when a new, highly motivated force appeared. The Arabs took Syria, Palestine, and Egypt from the Byzantines within a generation and took the Persian Empire completely. Everything Heraclius had won at such cost was gone within his lifetime. He died in 641, having watched his life's work unmade, reportedly broken by the experience.